Most companies build their annual budgets using either top down or bottom up approaches. But which one works better? Should leadership set the targets first, or should every department submit their own plans? And what happens when those bottoms up numbers are way higher than the leadership top down goals? In this video, we will break down the differences, pros and cons, and show you how FP&A can bridge the gap so you get a budget that's both strategic and realistic. And if you are preparing for FP&A interviews, this is a must know topic. Interviewers love to ask you how would you handle budgeting in different situations, whether it's a startup building its first budget or a large MNC aligning with global targets with local plans. So let's look at some common ways this question shows up in FP&A interviews and how you can approach them confidently. Can you explain the difference between top down and bottoms up budgeting? Which budgeting approach do you recommend for a fast growing startup? How would you handle a situation where bottoms up budget exceeds the top down target? In your experience, which approach works better in uncertain economic conditions? Have you ever had to reconcile a top down target with a bottom up input? How did you approach that? What's FP&A team's role when leadership sets aggressive top down targets that seem unrealistic? How do you ensure that bottoms up budget are realistic and not inflated? What are the key benefits and risks of each approach? If you joined a company with no formal budgeting process, would you start with a top down or a bottoms up, and why? Can top down and bottom up budgeting work together? How would you structure the budgeting process? Whether you are preparing for an FP&A interview or working in FP&A right now, understanding how these two approaches work and when to use each is a core FP&A skill that directly impacts how your company plans, spends, and delivers results. Let's break down the core concepts behind these two approaches, because understanding how they actually work will make it much easier to decide which one fits the best in different situations. Let's start with top down budgeting. In the top down budgeting, everything starts with the leadership or the senior management. Set high level targets, things like total revenue, profit margins, or the overall cost ceilings. They do this based on companies' strategic goals and what they want to achieve. These targets are then cascaded to the different departments who are expected to build their plans within those boundaries. Top down budgeting is a faster process and it ensures that the budget is aligned to the strategy right from the start. But the downside is that it may overlook operational realities, especially if the leadership isn't fully in touch with today's challenges. Next, let's move to bottoms up budgeting. Bottoms up budgeting takes the opposite approach. Here, the process starts with individual departments and teams who build their budgets based on what they actually need: resources, headcount, projects, and expected costs. Those individual budgets are then consolidated upwards into the overall company budget. This approach tends to be more accurate at the operational level because it's built directly from the people who closest work with the budgets. But it can also lead to inflated budgets if departments pad their numbers to give themselves breathing room. And without strong guidance, it may not fully align with the company's strategic goals. At FP&A Professionals Institute, our mission is to help 1 million finance professionals master finance and FP&A skills. We offer comprehensive FP&A and finance learning programs for all levels. Visit our website www.fpnaprofessionals.com to learn more and kickstart your FP&A journey today. Let's take a moment to look at the key differences between top down and bottoms up budget. Next, let's talk about the benefits and challenges of top down budgeting. With top down budgeting, the biggest advantage is that it keeps the whole budget tightly aligned with company strategy. Since the leadership is setting the high level targets, the budget naturally supports the big picture goals, whether it's expansion, profitability, or cost control. It is also faster because you're not waiting for every department to build out their plans from scratch. And it forces cost discipline upfront. When you have a clear spending limit, teams know that they have to prioritize. so there is less chance of a bloated budget. Plus, there is a clear ownership. The leadership drives the process, so there is no confusion about who's accountable. And this is a big one. It can feel disconnected from reality. If the leadership sets an ambitious target without understanding what's actually happening on the ground, you end up with unrealistic goals that are almost impossible to achieve. It also means that departments don't get much say in the process. So they might feel like the budget is being forced on them, which can actually hurt motivation. And because the focus is more on hitting the top level numbers, it is harder to quickly adapt to something if things change, like a new project, cost spike, or a shift in market conditions. Now, bottoms up budgeting flips that completely. Because budgets come directly from the teams doing the work, they tend to be a lot more realistic. The teams also feel a lot more ownership because they are involved in setting the numbers, and that makes them more accountable when it comes to delivering the results. Another big plus, you get a much clearer view of all the details, so it's easier to spot where the money is really going. And flexibility is better too. If a project needs more funding or priorities shift, teams can adjust faster since they've built the numbers themselves. But the bottoms up budget isn't perfect either. Because teams want to keep some buffer, there is always a risk that they will pad their budget, asking for more than they actually need just to be safe. It's also a slower process since every department has to build their own numbers, and then FP&A team has to review and consolidate everything, which can take weeks, sometimes months. Plus, there is a risk that each team focuses only on their own goals, which means that the budget might not fully support the company's overall strategy. And if every department uses different assumptions or methods, it can easily get very messy when you are trying to combine everything into one company wide budget. So, the reality is, most companies don't stick purely to top down or bottoms up approach. The best budgeting process usually blends both approaches so that you get the strategic alignment of top down with the realism and details of the bottoms up budgeting. So, here is how that works in practice. First, the leadership sets high level targets, revenues, profit margins, maybe some cost saving expectations. This gives everyone a clear strategic direction. Then, individual business units or departments build their own bottoms up budget, but they do it now with clear guardrails so they know what kind of spending limits and priorities they need to stick to. FP&A's role here is to act as a bridge. We take all those bottoms up submissions, check how they stack up against the top down goals, and reconcile any gap. Sometimes that means going back to the leadership and adjusting the targets. At other times, it might mean asking the teams to trim down their requests. Either way, FP&A helps make sure that the final budget is both realistic and aligned with the strategy. Another best practice is to use scenario planning. If leadership's top down targets are really aggressive, you can build a best case, base case, and a worst case. So you have room to adapt if things don't go exactly as planned. The key is constant communication. Let me repeat that. The key is constant communication. Leadership, FP&A, and department heads all need to be aligned so everyone understands not just the numbers but the why behind them. When you get the balance right, you end up with a budget that's grounded in reality, supports the company's big picture goals, and has buy in from the people who actually have to deliver on it. In top-down budgets, FP&A helps the leadership teams set the initial targets. We provide them the data and analysis, historical trends, benchmarks, competitor insights to make sure that those top-down targets are grounded in reality. Then FP&A works with the departments to cascade those targets down into detailed budgets, helping them understand how much room they have and where to focus. In bottoms up budgeting, FP&A's job starts with creating standard templates so every department builds builds their budget in the same way, using consistent assumptions for things like inflation, exchange rates, or salary increases. Once all those department budgets comes in, FP&A consolidates everything, reviews it for accuracy, realism, and alignment, and points out any red flags or inconsistencies. In both the approaches, FP&A also a translator between the leadership and operations, helping leadership understand what's realistic and helping teams understand why certain targets matter for the company and overall strategy. And of course, once the budget is approved, FP&A keeps the process going, tackling actuals versus budget, identifying variances, and making sure that the leadership gets early warning signs if spending or revenue starts drifting off track. In short, no matter which budgeting approach your company uses, FP&A is at the center, making sure that the numbers make sense, supporting the strategy, and making sure the budgets are actually achievable. Finally, let's look at some of the common situational interview questions you might come across. First, which budgeting approach do you recommend for fast growing startups and why? For fast growing startups, bottoms up budgeting usually works the best. Startups usually need granular visibility into costs, and teams often operate into rapidly changing conditions, meaning that they need a lot of flexibility. And bottoms approach helps capture those evolving needs, especially in areas like marketing, product development, and hiring. That being said, as the startup scales up and starts focusing on profitability, they can blend in both top down and bottoms up budgeting targets to drive cost discipline. Another question like this: in your experience, which approach works better in uncertain economic conditions? So, during uncertainties like an economic downturn or major supply chain disruption, tops down approach is often slightly more effective. This is because leaderships here need to act fast, clear cost reduction targets, and make sure that the company stays financially healthy. However, a bottoms up review of critical spends is equally important to identify areas where cost cuts would damage operations or future growth. Another interesting question: what is FP&A's role when leadership sets particularly aggressive top down targets that seem unrealistic? And this is a common FP&A challenge. Here, it is all about communication and data. It is FP&A's role to model different scenarios to show the leadership the potential risk of overly aggressive targets. For example, FP&A could present a best case scenario where targets are met but with significant operational strain. A base case or a realistic scenario showing that what's achievable based on historical data and current conditions. And finally, a worst case scenario showing the impact if the targets are missed. This helps leadership makes informed decisions and trade-offs rather than pushing down the numbers that aren't tied to reality. Here is another one: how do you ensure that bottoms-up budgets are realistic and not inflated? This is again where FP&A comes in. FP&A should be setting clear guidelines on acceptable cost assumptions like inflation rates, salary bands, etc. FP&A also should conduct review sessions with each and every department to challenge assumptions and ask for justification on the big ticket items. FP&A can also use benchmarking. Either it can compare against the historical data or peer companies to flag areas where spending looks excessive. Key here is transparency. Business teams need to know that FP&A isn't here to just cut costs, but to make sure that every dollar adds value to the company. And the final question for today: can tops down and bottoms up budgeting work together? Absolutely. And most FP&A teams use a hybrid approach. The best processes typically look like this. First, the leadership sets a high level strategic targets, the overall revenue, margin, and cost, which is the top down approach. Next, department build detailed plans with FP&A teams, which is a bottom up process. Next, FP&A team consolidates the plan, identifies gaps, and works with the leadership and departments to clear those gaps through prioritization, trade-offs, scenario adjustments, and negotiation. The goal here is to combine leadership strategic vision, the operational reality from the teams on the ground. I am curious to know, how does your company approach budgeting? Do you follow a tops-down process or a bottoms-up one or a mix of both? Let me know in the comments below, and I would love to hear to know how your FP&A teams handle it. Remember, budgeting isn't just about aligning numbers. It's about aligning strategy with reality, and FP&A teams are right at the heart of making that happen. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check the descriptions in the links below for free FP&A resources including interview preparation questions and guides. to help you crack your next interview. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.